lecture we will talk about the different performances of a process. Performances quantify the capability of the final output produced in the process to satisfy the customer needs and requests, and consequently to quantify the creation of value for the customer. Monitoring and improving performances is a fundamental managing tool for a company that wants to be process-oriented. To identify the set of indicators that allow us to measure the performances of a process, we should start by identifying which are the so-called critical success factors. Critical success factors are defined on the basis of the strategy of the company and represent those few dimensions that are critical for the company to succeed in the competitive market. Examples of critical success factors are the level of customization, the responsiveness speed, or the efficiency of the resources. In other words, we need to identify the key dimensions that contribute to value creation for the final customer. Once we have identified the critical success factor, we have then to identify performances on three main dimensions, which are general performances, internal performances, and external performances. General performances does not measure specific performances, but they typically help in quantify the process. In this category, we can measure, for example, input volumes, which measure the volumes or number of requests that are inputs to the process. For example, number of requests of variation in the request of the customer. Then we can measure resources that measure the physical resources involved in the process, such as workforce involved or technology used. Intangible resources, such as information or competencies needed in the process, or special resources, which are those resources that are peculiar to the specific process. Finally, among general indicators of performance, we can measure output volumes that represent the number of units of product or service that are realized within the process. Internal performances measure the proper functioning of the process, the different phases, and the variation of the process from the internal management of process point of view. For example, we can refer to the lead time of internal phases of the process or the rate of effectiveness. Finally, external performances refer to the results and the value perceived by the customer of the process. In particular, they measure the value created by the process for the customer that could be internal or external. We distinguish now performances on a more operational level with four main areas: cost, time, quality, and flexibility. All these four dimensions can be both measured at the internal or at the external level. Cost performances can be measured by different indicators. For example, internal cost performances refer to cost of the output, that represent the cost of the final output sustained by the company. To calculate the cost of the output, there are several techniques, such as the activity-based costing, that aim at mapping the cost of the different activities performed to realize the final product. Another example of internal cost performance is represented by the productivity of the resources involved in the processes, typically calculated by the ratio between output volumes or value and the inputs used to produce them. An example of external cost performance is instead the cost per client, that is, the cost attributed to the single customer for achieving the final output. The simplest example of this is the price paid by the final external customer to buy the product or service. We then have time performances, which refers to time needed to accomplish the process and answer to the need of the market. Competitive pressure on time is one of the main drivers of the adoption of a process orientation. Example of internal performances of time is the lead time, which is the range of time between the moment in which the inputs for the realization of the product or service are available and the moment in which the product or service is delivered to the final customer. Or, for example, the time to market, which represents the time needed for the realization and launch of a new product on the market. Instead, an example of external time performance is the response time. That is the time that passes between the moment in which the customer formally requests the product or service and the moment in which the request is satisfied. Another example of external time performance is timeliness, which is the respect of the response time agreed with the customer. Quality performances of a process instead measure the characteristic of an output that are able to satisfy explicitly or implicitly the needs of the customer. Internal quality performances are, for example, the conformity quality, that is the respect for every single component of the final output of the requirements defined in the process, or the rate of defectiveness of the produced product. Examples instead of external quality performances are the perceived quality of the output by the final customer and the service and assistance level towards the final customer. A key dimension to measure related to this is the overall customer satisfaction. Lastly, we have flexibility performances. Flexibility refers to the capability of the process to respond to the changes required by the final customer with limited time and cost impact. Example of internal flexibility performances is represented by the time needed to set new operations or the percentage of not used capacity. Example instead of external flexibility performances are time and cost for realization of customized product or time of delivery for urgent orders. To conclude, we can add an additional level of analysis saying that time and cost measure the internal or external efficiency of a process, while quality and flexibility measure the internal or external effectiveness of the process. We will talk about effectiveness and efficiency in a dedicated lecture.